In this unit, we'll be talking about the characteristics of the four basic tissue types inside the body, as well as some general characteristics of cells and tissues that we'll be referring back to throughout the entire course. So I'm going to start by defining what a tissue actually is, and then we'll move into talking about specific tissue types, the first one being epithelia. After that, we'll take a closer look at connective tissue, and in particular at bone and cartilage. I'm actually not going to talk too much about muscle and nervous tissue here because we have entire units dedicated to that a little bit later in the course. Lastly, I'm going to talk about tissue generation from stem cells, a couple of different examples of tissue transformations, and the mechanisms by which cells and tissues can die. Now, we spend a lot of time in this course thinking about events that take place inside of cells and tissues. So a tissue is a group of cells that are serving a common function inside the body. This doesn't necessarily mean that all the tissues have the same cell type. It just means that all the cells that are present in the tissue are working together towards some kind of common goal. Although we won't really see too many examples in this unit, groups of tissues that work together can form organs. One example that might be familiar to you is your skin, because it's the largest organ inside of your body. Your skin contains each of the four tissue types that we'll be talking about within this unit. Now, each type of tissue is unique in a variety of ways. So, for example, tissues can contain different types of cells. Muscle tissue is made up of muscle cells or myocytes, and nervous tissue is made up of neurons in neuroglia. So there's lots of diversity of cells. But tissues can also be different from each other in terms of their extracellular makeup. Having unique cells means that each of those cells can produce different signaling molecules and proteins, and those can travel out into the extracellular environment. So the unique composition of proteins and ions and signaling molecules and water outside of a cell collectively is known as the extracellular matrix. In the picture that's on the right-hand side of this slide, we're looking at connective tissue. And if you look closely, you can see that there are many different cell types within this connective tissue. But if you look at the extracellular matrix, you'll see that there's a lot of different protein fibers present there as well. So tissues are different in terms of cells, but also in terms of matrix. The four major tissue types inside the body are epithelial tissue, connective tissue, nervous tissue, and muscle tissue. And we're going to talk first about epithelial tissue because there's a lot of it inside the body. And it's also going to be one of the places where we find the most specialization within the organ systems that we cover in our course, particularly in the next half of the course. Now, epithelial tissue tends to be located at places inside the body that come into contact with external environments. And so this means that one of the primary functions of epithelia is actually to protect the body from physical trauma or from chemicals and pathogens that are present in those environments. To remember the protective functions of epithelia, it might be helpful to remember that the outermost layer of your skin, known as the epidermis, is composed of epithelial tissue. But epithelial tissue doesn't have to always be located superficially inside the body. In fact, it also lines your digestive tract. And that's the example that we're seeing at the bottom of this slide in the histology image. It's actually taken from the small intestine. And this really positions epithelia to make specific decisions about which types of molecules are able to enter the body through your digestive system. If we were to look at the molecular level at the plasma membrane of those epithelial cells, we would see that it's selectively permeable. And that's the reason why it can allow some beneficial molecules like glucose and amino acids and free fatty acids to enter the body, but still keep out harmful chemicals and bacteria that might be trying to enter the body through the digestive system. It's all due to selective permeability, which we know from our last unit is due to differences in expression of transporters and ion channels. The only thing I want to add now is that it's possible to move molecules in both directions across the plasma membrane. So when molecules leave the cell into the extracellular fluid, that's known as secretion. And when molecules enter the cell from the extracellular fluid, that's known as absorption. Occasionally, epithelia can also serve as receptors, but this happens pretty rarely because receptors are usually located on neurons, But in the case of our specialized senses like vision and hearing, it's actually epithelial cells that capture photons and sound waves. Now, as a tissue, epithelia has a high degree of cellularity, which means that the ratio of cells to matrix is very high. In other words, the cells are really, really densely packed within the tissue. It also tends to be a polarized tissue, which means that different membrane faces have different functions. Again, thinking about this idea of selective permeability, that means that we might have differences in the channels or transporters that are expressed on one side of the membrane that might not be present on the opposite side of the membrane. Because the epithelia are located near external environments, they often have to attach to deeper layers of tissue beneath them, and they often have to attach to each other as well in order to form a functional barrier in order to protect the body. Epithelia tends to be avascular, which means that it lacks blood supply, and that's one of the reasons why the superficial layer of the skin that I mentioned just a second ago is actually composed of dead keratinized epithelial cells. And in some cases, the avascularity can also be an example of a nice structure-function relationship as well. So for example, epithelia make up the anterior surface of your eye, which is responsible for collecting photons from the external environment and bringing them into your eye so that they can bind to receptors. If epithelia was a vascular tissue that had blood flowing through it, then the pigmented proteins inside the blood would reflect and refract the light, and you wouldn't be able to see anything because the photons would never make it through the eye to the receptor. Lastly, because epithelia is constantly being damaged by physical and chemical trauma, it tends to be a rapidly dividing tissue.